Thank you. All right, hi, Colin. Thank you for coming tonight.
Yes. Are we ready, Mike? Should we just, do you want to wait one more minute?
Are there still people coming in?
There have been a couple more, yeah.
Okay, maybe give maybe another minute or two and then we can get rolling.
Yep. Okay. All right, you ready?
Let's do it.
All right. So welcome everyone. Before we begin, I just want to mention that tonight's presentation is part of the NEA Big Read. NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. I'm very excited to introduce my colleague, Michael Geary. Michael is Associate Professor of English and the Writing Center Coordinator at Bristol Community College. As a 20-year veteran in higher education, he has taught a variety of courses, including theme-based first-year composition and technical writing, science fiction literature, survey courses in English, American, and world literature, Shakespeare, and most recently, the criminal in literature and art. He has taught Homer's The Odyssey in various classes for 17 years. Professor Geary has presented at the Conference on College Composition and Communication 7 times and currently serves as a co-chair of the conference's Environmental Rhetoric and Composition Special Interest Group. His writing has been published in the Journal of the Assembly for Expanded Perspectives on Learning. Professor Geary is also the Vice President of the Faculty and Professional Staff Senate at Bristol and is a former chair of the English Department's Portfolio Assessment Project. His presentation, Odysseus Revered, Reviled, and Still Relevant, intends to show us how the character of Odysseus has been depicted for over 3,000 years as part of an oral tradition, canonical literature, and this year's Big Read selection, Madeline Miller's Circe. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Geary, and we will have questions at the end of his presentation. So take it away, Mike.
Thank you very much, Laura, and I thank all of you for coming out tonight, for zooming on in for tonight's presentation. And I just want to say I've had a lot of fun digging back into the roots of ancient Greece and really coming to know Odysseus and all of his various friends who I thought I knew pretty well, but I find that the more that I dig into the mythology, I learn more. I learn more and more things about him. And really, my goal for tonight is a couple of things that I want to really do for you folks. Laura, if we could go to the next slide, please.
Sure.
Give you a sense of what the agenda will be for tonight. First of all, I think it's important to kind of give you sort of this historical context so we know exactly what time periods, plural on that, we're talking about. I want to give you a brief overview of the text that I'm going to be covering as part of this, and then I want to do something in the tradition of Homer. I want to storytell. I want to tell you Odysseus's story, but not just the famous part that everybody knows about. Oh, the Cyclops and the pun and all that. That's great, but there's so much more to cover with that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the various texts that I've identified to actually tell that story, to give you that overview. And then I'm going to talk about how this is still relevant for the 21st century, or why I think it's relevant for the 21st century. And in putting this presentation together, the one thing that I did not do is I did not dig into the centuries of literary criticism that have been written about these particular texts. Instead, what I did is I sat down and I reread all of these from the perspective of a 21st century writer, 21st century reader. And I really wanted to kind of see, like, what did I take away from this? Like, how is this relevant to my world now? And there were a lot of things that I uncovered about this whole narrative arc that are still very, very relevant to us. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Laura. So first of all, this year's big read text, Madeline Miller's Circe, actually covers a very, very broad length of time, right? It actually predates the time when Odysseus even existed. What we're dealing with this is a time period of the Mycenaean warrior kings of the Bronze Age. For those of you who read Circe, you know, she actually starts with the Minoans, which is actually the society before this one. So you get a sense of how much time that novel takes up. This was a time period where, again, it's a very warlike tribe, and they go on these vast conquests, and they're always at war with each other. There's never a very peaceful time about them. But one thing that has been sort of proven by archaeology is that there was a city named Troy that was destroyed around 1225 BCE. So that's when we have the fall of Troy. The Trojan horse would come during that particular time period. And then from there, that civilization, these warrior kings, that civilization disappears around 1050 BCE. So almost 200 years after the fall of Troy. And then we enter the Grecian Dark Ages. And this is important to kind of realize that the stories of Odysseus and Achilles and all of them, those are passed along as part of an oral tradition. They're not written down. So you have all these generations of ancient Greeks who are retelling the story, adding their own variations to it, until we get to Homer, who lived, we think, sometime between 800 BCE and 650 BCE. But when we think of Homer, we really can't think of it being one person. I know I've seen memes that put Homer Simpson all dressed up as a Greek and this, that, and the other thing. But more than likely, Homer is a whole collection of people, right? He is a generation rather than one specific person. And it's at that point where these stories are actually written down and then passed along from there. And just when you want to think about that from perspective, how much has happened since roughly 650 BCE, right? How much the world has changed, how many other texts have come into being, how many other stories have been told since then, and yet there is still something about Odysseus that allows him to transcend the rise of monotheism, the significant changes of the Middle Ages, world wars, all of these things. Odysseus still exists and is in wide publication today. My gosh, how and why does that happen? What is it about this character? One of the things that happens here is that during this Homeric period, the Iliad and the Odyssey, those two epics that he's noted for, really become the standard for heroic behavior. In fact, the educated of the time period, they would learn their ABCs by reading the Homeric epics. And the code of conduct, the way that people would pursue honor and glory. That was instilled in the population during that particular time period. So these texts had very significant cultural influence. And it wasn't just in this time period either. As we get a little further into history, the stories that Homer had laid out begin to evolve even more. Next slide, please. So in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on what I'm going to call some of the key texts of the time period. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and again, those were written sometime between 800 and 650 BCE. And then Virgil's Aeneid, which notice that's written hundreds of years later. And I'll comment more about why that's significant. Also, two of Sophocles' plays, we only have 7 of them, even though he wrote over 100 of them. But 2 of them specifically deal with Odysseus, Ajax, which was from 443 BCE, and Philoctetes from 409 BCE. Both of those plays tell stories that happen within the time period of the Iliad, well, actually right after the Iliad and before the Odyssey. And then Dante's Inferno, which is the first installment of the Divine Comedy, which is a Christian epic. And how much time does Odysseus spend in there? It's about a microsecond, but it's significant enough that I want to go ahead and talk about that with you folks. Of course, Madeline Miller's Circe, how that all kind of fits together, helps to kind of unpack this mythology for us. And then I want to touch upon briefly another book that I'm still actually in the process of reading, Jonathan Shea's Odysseus is in America. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on the significance of that text when I get to it. All right, Laura, next slide, please. Okay, so Odysseus and his reputation. First of all, who are his parents? Because parents were important in the ancient times. Father was Laertes and mother was Anticlea. Later on, when we get to Sophocles' time, there's this new idea that he was actually the son of Sisyphus. Of course, he's noted for endlessly rolling the rock up a hill. How or why that happened, I'm still trying to figure that piece out, but that's a part of it. It's actually mentioned in Sophocles' plays. He's the Prince of Ithaca, and there is actually an island called Ithaca. You can find it on the map today, but scholars are kind of debating if that's the real Ithaca because the geography doesn't match up to some of the stories of it. But there's a debate over that, but that's a rabbit hole I won't go down. He's noted for being a great warrior, absolutely. That's sort of first and foremost, and also as a trickster. And we mean that in a positive and a negative sense, that he would be able to put a good-natured joke over on some people, but also he would do that with ill intent in mind. At various times, we see him as being a mediator. There's a huge debate about whether or not he's a great leader. Definitely a leader, a great one, a not so great one, somewhere in between. There's a gigantic moral debate about that, actually, whether or not he's selfish or selfless. And as you get closer and closer to modern times, people are actually less kind to him. Sophocles' time, they don't really think too very highly of Odysseus at all. And the other thing as well, he inherits more sons as he gets older. So in the original mythology, he just has his son Telemachus. As we get to Sophocles' time, he has another son named Telegonus, and then he has another son with Calypso, and then he's not repopulating half of the ancient world, but he just magically starts having more and more sons as the mythology evolves. And that's the important piece about it, is that this is really a story that's written by generations, not from the pen of one person in particular. All right, Laura, if we could go to the next slide, please. All right, and so now I'm going to tell you Odysseus' story using these texts. And one of the things I will be doing as part of the presentation is actually putting the words of these texts in front of you. I know this is a diverse audience. Some of you may be familiar with one of the texts, all of the texts, none of the texts. So I wanted to let some of the actual writing itself speak for itself. And I'm actually going to maybe give you a little dramatic performance of some of this as well, because I like to have fun, and this is what I do with my students, and I'm not doing that now because all my classes are asynchronous, so y'all going to have to kind of roll with me a little bit as I indulge in my a little bit more dramatic side for you. So we'll start with the Iliad. And one thing about the Iliad that's really kind of a striking thing is that it's a war story, a very graphic war story at that. Timeline for it, it's set near the end of the Trojan War. According to the mythology, the Trojan War goes on for 10 years. Some historians say that's nonsense. Then we think about long wars, looking at you, Vietnam. That goes on for a long period of time. So why wouldn't the Trojan War go on for 10 years? Certainly, Iliad itself takes place near the end of that time period. Odysseus is a secondary character in the Iliad. He's not the main character. That epic is mainly about Achilles, even though Achilles spends most of the time sitting on his boat, weeping, lamenting, being a punk, whatever. That's Achilles. Odysseus is depicted as being very loyal to Agamemnon and Menelaus. Of course, those are the two brothers who are basically leading the charge of the Trojan War. And we know why it starts, because Paris took Helen, who of course was the wife of Menelaus, and ran away with her, and he got mad, and he got his brother, and he got all of those warrior princes and kings to go with him, and they have this big calamity that is the Trojan War. A couple of ways that Odysseus is described early on: a man wise with the wisdom of Zeus himself, and he's also described as this man who is never at a loss. He's always able to figure out how to get out of certain situations. Oh, and he does throughout the course of his many adventures. He's also someone it's very clear he won't be spoken down to. So if you give him attitude, he will throw it right back at you. Some highlights of what happens to him throughout the course of the Iliad. Achilles, as I mentioned, is sulking for a variety of that. That's because of the fact that Agamemnon decides he's going to be the man, and he's going to decide to take one of Achilles' concubines. And Achilles replies by saying, "That's not fair. So you know what? When you go into battle, I'm not going to go fight. I'm going to go sit on my boat and watch." And that's what he does. And in the meantime, the Greeks basically are getting beaten really badly. And Agamemnon's like, "Oh, can we try to convince Achilles to come back?" So he sends Odysseus. He tries to convince Achilles to come back, and he fails. So Odysseus is not always able to persuade people to do his bidding. He also winds up going on a night raid with Diomedes. That's someone that he's paired with very frequently throughout these texts, and you'll see that as we go a little bit forward. And the job there is to get some intel on what's going on with the Trojans. It's basically overnight in between the battle, and the battle picks up again the next day. He does wind up being injured in battle, and there's a large chunk of the novel where he's not fighting. He's actually kind of gimpy and lame, so the fighting kind of goes on without him. Near the end, he actually is involved with two contests during the funeral of Patroclus. Of course, Patroclus is Achilles' BFF. Some people say that that was Achilles' lover. That's up for debate. He winds up dying because he took Achilles' armor. If you saw the movie Troy, you know, he stole it. If you read the Iliad, you know, Achilles actually put it on him and encouraged him to go. And then there's a big funeral ceremony that happens, and there's basically the celebration of his life. As part of that, he wrestles Ajax. It's significant about the relationship with Ajax, and you'll see why coming up in the narrative. It actually ends in a tie, right? The two of them are kind of evenly matched with each other. And then the last thing of significance for him in the Iliad is that he winds up winning a foot race at the funeral. So the Iliad ends really with the funeral for Hector. Some folks think it actually ends with the Trojan horse. The Trojan horse isn't even in the epic. That's an entirely separate story that has nothing to do with the Iliad. And to kind of give you a sense of sort of Odysseus, I'm going to put sort of some of his words and actions on the screen for you next. So, Laura, go into the next slide. The next thing that happens, for this next slide that's going to come up.
There we go.
There it is. Remember I said that he gives some attitude. At one point early on, Agamemnon's trying to rally the troops, and he goes and he says to Odysseus, "Ah, you men are being lazy, this, that, and the other thing." And this is what Odysseus throws back at him. "What a thing to say, Prince. Bite it back and let it stay behind your teeth. Do you say we are slack when our people go out to battle? You shall see for yourself if you like. And if such matters interest you, you shall see the father of Telemachus fighting in the enemy's front line. What you say is so much wind." So he's not going to put up with this, and it's not the only time that he talks back to Agamemnon. There are several instances of that. So again, even though these folks are fighting together, there's antagonism that goes on a lot throughout the course of the narrative. Laura, if we could go to the next slide, please. One of the things that, as a 21st century reader, that I experienced with the Iliad is how violent this book is. and I read it years ago and then revisited. I didn't recall him being this violent. And I wanted to give you a sense of what happens when Odysseus is fighting throughout the course of this. And this is just one excerpt. And Odysseus first leapt upon Diopetes and wounded his shoulder, then Thun and Inimus, and then stabbed Chrysothemis under the shield upon the mid-nipple as he stepped out of his chariot. Down he fell in the dust and clutched the earth. These he left and wounded Cherub Hippocetus, own brother to Socos. Then Socos ran up to defend his brother, but Odysseus drove his spear through the man's back between his shoulders and out at the chest. He fell with a thud, and Odysseus cried out triumphant. And this type of thing goes on for pages and pages and pages and pages. There are over 260 deaths in the Iliad, and their decapitations, their amputations, their impalements. They're being crushed by rocks. They're being impaled by arrows. They are vomiting blood. It is coming out their nose. I'm like, oh my gosh. And these people went through this for 10 years. And this is a piece that I think is so significant to understanding Odysseus. Because if you don't read the Iliad, you have a lot of questions about why he does certain things in the Odyssey. All right, Laura, if we could go to the next slide, please. So the next text, which takes place after the Iliad, is Sophocles' play Ajax. Now remember, Ajax in the Iliad. Well, after Achilles' death, and of course we know Achilles' heel shot through the heel by Apollo, he dies. One of the things that's a big preoccupation is what happens to the armor of the dead warrior. Well, apparently Ajax thought he should get Achilles' armor. Somehow Odysseus gets it, and Ajax is infuriated over this. He thinks he's been disrespected, and he has it in his head that he's going to kill Agamemnon, Menelaus, and Odysseus. Loyalties don't last here. And so Athena's like, that's not happening on my watch. So what she does is she puts a little hex on him, and he thinks that all of these cattle that they have actually taken out of Troy are actually Odysseus and Agamemnon and Menelaus. So what does Ajax do? He leads them all to his tent, and then he tortures and slaughters these animals, thinking that he's torturing and slaughtering Odysseus and Agamemnon and Menelaus. And it's absolutely bizarre and weird what he's doing. What happens, just to continue the plot, when Ajax realizes he's done this, he commits suicide. And then a debate ensues over what should happen with the disposal of Ajax's body, because he's turned against the leaders that he was previously fighting for. Agamemnon and Menelaus want him to be devoured by dogs, wild dogs that are apparently forever existing on the plains of Troy, because that's what happens to anyone who is not worthy of respect. Odysseus says to Agamemnon, hold on a second, and I'm going to show you that passage in a moment, and he even offers to help with Ajax's burial. And Laura, if we could go to the next slide, please. So a couple of things that stood out for me early on is this conversation that Athena has with Odysseus. So Athena says, do you know, Odysseus, the power of the gods? Was there ever a more resourceful man once than this? One equal to any occasion. And at this point, they've just discovered the guts of the animals all over the inside of Ajax's tent. Odysseus replies, I know of none, and yet I pity him. Against me though he is, for he is shackled to a dreadful end. His fate makes me think of my own. I see that our lives are nothing but illusion, fugitive shades. And that line, I think, is really important. Like, what does that mean? I see that our lives are nothing but illusion and fugitive shades. Does that mean the significance of our lives as we see them is just a sort of in our own minds? Like, is my own importance sort of a figment of my own imagination? I think that line is significant, and I want you all to kind of keep that in mind as we go through and look at some other things that happen with them. And then Athena says, well, seeing this is so, let no haughty word against the gods escape your lips, nor be puffed up if you excel another in prowess or material gain. So Athena gives him some advice. I guarantee you're going to see him break that advice in the story that goes on ahead. Laura, next slide, please. And then this is, again, him standing up to Agamemnon. Right? I ask you by the gods, not mercilessly, to cast out this man unburied. Never let brute force take over and trample humanity underfoot. He too, and the whole army, was my worst enemy the moment I became possessor of Achilles' armor. Even so, I cannot fail to respect him or deny that, except for Achilles, he was the bravest of all the Argives that came to Troy. Therefore, I cannot dishonor him with injustice. That would be destructive, not just of him, but by the laws of heaven. When a brave man dies, it is wrong to injure him, even if you loathe him. And that's significant in so many ways, because Sophocles and the various playwrights of that time period tend to have a very negative view of Odysseus. Yet in this play, Odysseus comes off as being more honorable. He's actually getting good press here. And his argument that he makes here, it speaks to him as being a logical speaker, someone who's able to present things with a series of reasons. Notice later how he's going to actually kind of break that, as you'll see going forward. Laura, next slide, please. Then almost immediately as a contrast, we come to Philoctetes, which Philoctetes is actually mentioned in the Iliad because of what happens. Odysseus strands him on an island because of the fact that he got bit by a snake, his foot got infected, and it was stinky, and it was bothering all of the men. So Odysseus is like, well, here's how I handle it. Plop, I'm going to put you on the island and we're going to sail away. And then he lies and says that it was actually Philoctetes' request. It wasn't. Odysseus dumped him there. What happens is that they need to go and get him because he's actually a descendant of Heracles or Hercules, and he actually has Hercules' bow. And the gods have now said, well, the only way you're going to beat Troy is if you have his bow. So you need to go and get him, or at least the bow, off of the island. So Odysseus goes with Neoptolemus, who is actually Achilles' son, and Odysseus sets out to manipulate Philoctetes with lies. These Greek names, you try to say them fast, they just trip over the tongue. Right? And you can have Neoptolemus do that. And Neoptolemus does that. They actually get the bow away from Philoctetes, but then Neoptolemus has this awakening that this is the wrong thing to do, and he goes and he gives him the bow back. Odysseus follows, protesting the whole time, saying, no, 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 what are you doing? You shouldn't do this. And he threatens him. And he says, well, if you do this, you're going to have to go through me and all of my army. And Neoptolemus says to him, good, we'll go for you and your army. And so Odysseus just stomps away kind of angrily, the same way Agamemnon does in Ajax when Odysseus tells him, no, this body must wind up being buried. Now, Laura, the next slide, please. You want to see Odysseus at work. Again, this is a study in contrast. Odysseus says to him, to Neoptolemus, so what we have to plan is a way for you to steal the magic bow. I know, my boy, it's not your character to lie or injure others, but success is always sweet if we get something that we want. Just do it, and we'll be proved right. Lend yourself to me and be a rascal, just for a day. Afterwards, you'll have all the time in the world to be the most upright man alive. So, of course, at the end, one little lie doesn't matter, and it's Philoctetes, and it's for the greater good of the Trojan army, of the Greek army. We defeat Troy. Go ahead and do it. No one will really know. And, of course, Neoptolemus is not having this. So, Laura, if we could go to the next slide, please. So, Neoptolemus says, so he's unapproachable, except by trickery, as I am telling you. But telling lies is shameful, don't you think? Not if the lie brings salvation. How can one face oneself as a liar? You're a loser if you hesitate. Well, my goodness, certainly this is not the same upstanding Odysseus that we just saw talking about doing the honorable thing. He's endorsing lying. This is not something that I would want to teach my young son, so I'm not going to consider Odysseus to be a role model here. And Neoptolemus overcomes all of this. He says this is wrong, and what winds up happening with Philoctetes, to kind of complete that story, Neoptolemus brings him back to the Trojan battlefield. The gods heal Philoctetes' foot. He doesn't have a stinky foot anymore, and then he helps them with actually defeating the Trojans. So there's a reason why all these things wind up playing out. Odysseus thinks he sees the big picture, but he doesn't. And lying and trickery doesn't always get his way. All right, so Laura, go to the next slide, please. Now I'm going to leave Greek literature behind, and we're going to go over to Roman literature because that's where we actually kind of capture the fall of Troy, and it's not told from the perspective of Odysseus, it's told from the Trojans. Now, Virgil, of course, is writing this, right before the birth of Christ. So hundreds of years have passed now since the Odyssey has been written, and Virgil knows Homer's work. So the Aeneid, the first part reads like the Odyssey, and the second part reads like the Iliad, and he's intentionally mimicking it. And Aeneas's journey to found Italy, which of course is now based on the assumption that he of course founded Rome, which has been founded by this time. So he's not really foretelling anything, but he's sort of reinventing the narrative in some respects. And we see a variety of things that winds up happening that relate to Odysseus. He's called Ulysses in this text because that's the Latin version of his name that shows up in all the Roman literature. Of course, this is the Trojan horse. You see a picture of it on the screen. The Trojans are warned that this is not a good idea. All right, Laocoon is one of the Trojans. He comes in and says, Ulysses is a ruffian, right? He's a ruffian. This is a trick of his. And then to sell this even further, this echoes exactly what we saw happen in Philoctetes. Ulysses leaves behind a spy named Sinon, who is then taken prisoner by the Trojans, and Sinon says, oh, that Odysseus, he was talking about all these horrible things that I had done. He was giving me all of this bad press. And then he says, you see the quote there, the guile and envy of Ulysses, nothing unheard of there. So his reputation is basically that this is a trickster and this is someone who is envious. This is not a good dude to be hanging out with. And of course, Sinon sells it. He sells it better than Euryalus sells stealing the boat from Philoctetes. And we know what winds up happening. Ulysses is in the belly of the Trojan horse. He leads the Greeks out. They burn the city of Troy to the ground. And it's depicted brilliantly in the Aeneid. So if you really want the story of it, the Aeneid is the book that you want to find. Now, what happens, and you're going to see a graphic in a little bit of Odysseus's journey. Aeneas is on his way to go basically discover Italy. He's supposed to be going to the west coast of Italy. So he basically sails along a similar path that Odysseus goes along. He happens to stop on the island of the Cyclops, and we find out that Odysseus actually left one of his men there. I guarantee you won't find that in Homer, but this individual, Aeneid, winds up being left behind on the Cyclops Island, and he's like basically doing the Robinson Crusoe thing. Okay, Robinson Crusoe a couple of centuries later, but whatever. You get the idea. He's trying to survive in this environment and not be eaten by the Cyclops, and so Aeneas winds up taking him on board. And we don't actually really see Ulysses in the Aeneid. We hear a lot about him and see his actions. And one other time that he's mentioned, he's referred to as that ringleader of atrocity, Ulysses of the Wind King's line. So again, there is no love for Odysseus, Ulysses here. He's really depicted as being a trickster, someone who's a negative character. And so far, we're kind of at a 50-50 split. He's rather favorable in the Iliad, rather favorable in Ajax, Philoctetes, not so much. The Aeneid, definitely not. These Romans hate the Greeks, and well, why not? They burned Troy. If these are the descendants, of course, they're going to be angry. All right, Laura, next slide, please. This is what everyone's familiar with, right? And a lot of times the folks read the famous story of the Odyssey, the famous stuff. I wonder, well, where did he go? Well, there you go, folks. I mean, this is like drunken escapades on the high sea. He is all over the map. When you see he's supposed to be going to number 16, Ithaca, and he starts at number 1, that should be a pretty straight shot. Instead, he does something that he shouldn't do. He starts going north, and he gets into a conflict with the Cicones because, of course, they're warriors coming back, and they want to plunder. So what do? They plunder to a point. Odysseus says, hey, let's go, to his men. His men are like, no, we're going to stay longer. And they get into a big war, and they also wind up angering Athena. Athena is like Odysseus's BFF, And what happens is that Athena sends them a storm and blows them all the way to number 3, the Lotus Eaters. So be careful what you're doing, because they're going to send you way off course. And then what follows are some of the usual escapades that we see from the Lotus Eaters. He goes to the Cyclops. Of course, that's where the famous no man pun winds up coming in. I won't hit upon absolutely everything here, because I think a lot of folks are familiar with the story. Then to the Lastrygonians, and then, of course, the island of Circe, which is just off the coast of Italy, if we follow this map. And he winds up going from Circe to the land of the dead. And this is all retold, of course, in the Circe novel as well. One of the things that's significant is that when he goes to the land of the dead, he sees Ajax. And this is one of those fun facts that when you read it, you kind of like whatever. But when you read the larger mythology, it kind of makes a little bit more sense now. Ajax refuses to engage with Odysseus. And of course, when he goes to the land of the dead, he's offering blood, so this way the spirits can come and talk. Ajax wants nothing to do with him. And Odysseus says, well, even in the afterlife, you're still all angry with me. Now, as Odysseus goes on all these journeys, there's all kinds of problems that are raised about the morality of his character. For example, the situation with the Cyclops. Right? They go into the cave. His men say, Odysseus, bad idea. He's like, no, let's chill out and let's eat some of his cheese just to kind of see what happens. You know, maybe he'll give us some gifts. And he does. And then what happens is that the Cyclops, over 3 meals, eats 6 of his men. And then he tricks him, he blinds him, and they're able to get away. And he gives them the name of No Man. And then as he's leaving, Odysseus just has to dig in and say, my name is Odysseus. And when he does that, then that leads to the problem with Poseidon, and Poseidon deciding that, you know what, I'm going to make sure Odysseus suffers because he blinded my son. Ironically, Poseidon is a bad dad because Polyphemus the Cyclops doesn't know that Poseidon is really his father because he's never gone to check in on his son. So the only time that happens is when Polyphemus decides to question it, and Poseidon's like, I'll show you I'm my son, and cause all kinds of chaos for Odysseus. And then bad decisions happen when he goes to the Lastrygonians. He winds up sending 11 of his ships. There are 12 ships originally. 11 of them go into the harbor, and he stays out. Well, the Lastrygonians just happen to be cannibals, just like the Cyclops. That's apparently common. And they sink 11 of his ships, eat 11 ships worth of men, and Odysseus goes away. And there's this whole moral thing. Should he have gone in to try to help them? Should he have warned them, not all of them, to sail into the bay? So you get these problems that Odysseus has, and they kind of all checker out from there. So one of the things that we have to kind of worry about is, well, is he even concerned about his men? Do his men even matter? And Laura, if we could go to the next slide, please, with that. A couple of things that kind of stand out for me about that. You know, when he's on Circe's island, of course, Circe's turned his men into pigs, and she wants to wine and dine him, and he says, oh, Circe, what man with justice in his mind would think of food and drink before he freed his comrades and could see them with his eyes? So seems like he's concerned about his men. Maybe they shouldn't be pigs before I enjoy myself. And then later, when he winds up going and he has the encounter with Scylla, he arms himself to defend his men. Right, he could have been cowering below deck saying, I hope they don't eat me. He puts himself out on the deck as if he could actually be sacrificed. You know, maybe I'll be one of the 6 men that winds up getting taken. And what happens is that he turns his head for a second and Scylla snatches 6 of his men. And then he turns and sees them, and there at the door to her deep cavern, Scylla swallowed them. As in their horrid struggle, my friends stretched out to me their hands, the saddest sight my eyes have ever seen in all that I suffered in my journeys on the sea. So certainly, there's evidence here that Odysseus legitimately cares about his men. So on the one hand, he makes some questionable decisions. Is he concerned about his men? Absolutely. Homer's Odyssey would have you believe that he's a very caring individual about his men. He depicts them in a very favorable light. Now, we also need to realize that this whole story that he narrates is told in flashback. It's told when he's in the court of the Phaeacians, and it's told to basically distract from the fact about talking about the Trojan War itself. So let me tell you about my journey home. And he goes into Fantasyland. At no point do we actually see these things happen. It's all told from Odysseus, who, remember, he was just talking a little while ago about sometimes you need to lie. And then here's the reaction he gets, if we could go to the next slide, Laura. This is when we're still in the land of the dead. Odysseus hasn't finished the narrative yet, and this is what Alcinous says to him. Odysseus, you don't seem to be a cheat or a liar, though we know that the dark earth breeds so many, and every land deceived with tales of things that no man's ever seen. But you have grace and wisdom in your speech. You've told with skill as a poet would sing your own and all the Argive sufferings. Oh my gosh, if we want to think about the way Odysseus is able to play somebody like a fiddle, clearly he's doing that here with this narrative. So it begs a larger question, as martyred readers, what are we supposed to make of this? Right? Are we supposed to believe that he's all virtuous and a great leader, or that this is a not so great guy who is maybe trying to save face? Laura, if we could go to the next slide, please. And just to kind of summarize a little bit of the rest of the Odyssey, because there's more to the Odyssey than just the Cyclops in that piece. The larger narrative arc involves his son Telemachus and Penelope, whose house has been overrun by the suitors. Odysseus does go back home. She disguises him. There's the famous contest of the bow. Whoever can win the hand of Penelope must be able to string the bow of Odysseus and shoot the arrow through 12 axes. Of course, Odysseus is there in disguise. The suitors try one after another to do this. They can't. They all fail. Telemachus fails. Old man who's disguised as this weak, frail, old beggar, he wins the contest. He does it without any problems whatsoever. And then what happens? Odysseus slaughters the suitors systematically. Over 100 suitors die at the hand of Odysseus, Telemachus, and a couple of loyal hands. I know the audio is getting a little bit light. Let me see if this helps. And then what follows is we wind up having a war with the suitors' families, which Athena has to force it to come to an end. Right? Otherwise, the battle would just keep going, and the body count would wind up sort of piling up. So that's how the Odyssey ends. That's where Odysseus's story ends, according to Homer. But then we come to Madeline Miller. And Laura, if we could go to the next slide, please.
Yes. Can you also move maybe a little closer to your phone, because we can't hear you that well?
Okay.
Yeah, that's better.
That's better? Can we hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, awesome. All right, so now that's going to take us over into Circe. Laura, if we could do the next slide. And of course, Circe retells the meeting with Odysseus. And it's an important perspective, and it's one that we haven't completely had yet. It's really an outsider looking in at the character of Odysseus. So what do we kind of learn from the novel about him? Well, we very much get the sense that he's a war-worn man, right? He wears his scars, he's tired, he's fatigued. At times he oscillates between being peaceful and violent. At one point, he expresses anger and grief over his men's lack of wisdom. And in this story, of course, he impregnates Circe. That's not a new story to Madeline Miller. That actually is from the time of Sophocles. And then we wind up, of course, he winds up having another son by the name of Telegonus. Now, what happens to Odysseus when he gets back home after he slaughtered the suitors? Athena has put an end to the war. He starts believing that all of the folks on the island are out to get him. And he becomes really preoccupied with this. The people are going to take my power, my wealth, my everything. He basically can't leave the war behind him, and he tries to find relevance, right? All of his friends that he went into war with, they're all doing well. They built a new kingdom here, and all this lovely stuff has happened. And he tries to offer his services to them. None of them want him. And he winds up becoming sort of a jaded older man. Telegonus has a similar experience that Telemachus has. He wants to know who his father is, so he leaves Circe. He goes to discover him, and what winds up happening is that Telegonus accidentally winds up killing Odysseus, or rather, Odysseus winds up killing himself. Telegonus has been given a spear by his mother, because of the fact that Athena had previously come to Circe and said, I basically want to kill your son. So she gives him an enchanted spear with just the slightest scratch. If you touch it, you will die. Telegonus gets into a fight with Odysseus, and Odysseus, as he's wrestling it, he scratches his cheek and he dies instantly. And Telegonus has all kinds of grief over this. I killed my father and I just met him. Oh my gosh. And then we learn more about it from there. So I want to take you through a couple of very choice passages from Circe. Some of it Odysseus says, some of it Circe says, and something Telemachus says, and then Penelope. So Laura, if we could go to the next slide, please. At the beginning, when Odysseus first meets Circe, here's what he has to say about his men. It's my fault as their captain. I should have kept them better in line, but we have been at war, and you know how that can tarnish even the best men. And these, though I love them well, will never be the best. And that's such a fruit cocktail of compliment and put down, right? I mean, he's like, they've been at war, so you know how that is. And I love them, but they're not that great, right? So they're good, downplay. Like there's a mix of things going on there. That's Odysseus. That seems pretty consistent with the Odysseus we've seen previously. And this is what Circe says about him. His eyes were bright now, storm lit. When he talked, he was a lawyer and bard and crossroads charlatan all at once, arguing his case, entertaining, pulling back the veil to show you the secrets of the world. It was not just his words, though they were clever enough. It was everything together. His face, his gestures, the sliding tones of his voice. So we wonder how someone like Alcinous is going to fall for whatever Odysseus is selling. Well, there you go, because she puts it perfectly in words in a way that Alcinous doesn't do in the Odyssey. That gives you a very good sense of who Odysseus is. And Laura, next slide, please. And this speaks to a little bit more of what's going on with Odysseus's mindset. And I think you might see some continuity to a passage I showed you before. Odysseus has this first quote: "You promise mercy to spies so they will spill their story. Then you kill them afterward. You beat men who mutiny. You coax heroes from their sulks. You keep spirits high at any cost." And at this point, he's kind of saying about you do what needs to be done in order to survive. And then a little bit later, he says, this is when he's in the Trojan horse: "I crouched in the wooden belly of with my picked men, and if any shook with terror and strain, I put my knife to his throat. So if he moved, he would cut their throats so they would be dead." Let's think about that for a moment. He was willing to be in the belly of the Trojan horse with a body that is bleeding out with a slit throat if any of them would reveal that they were inside. My goodness, right? What is that telling us about this character? And then after this, once Odysseus has sort of been settled a little bit more, Circe starts to see a little bit more of him. And this is what she says: "Sometimes he would go off smiling with them, but sometimes he would shout or strike them. He was not so easy and even as he pretended to be. He could still marshal himself, but it cost him. And after, he was prone to moods and tempers." So you don't get that impression of Odysseus when he's telling his story in the Odyssey, right? You don't get that unevenness. He plays it off that he's pretty even, but that's not what this eyewitness winds up telling us. All right, Laura, if we could go to the next slide, please. All right, so we wind up hearing a lot about what Odysseus was like from the perspective of Telemachus. There's several sections in the novel where we learn about what that relationship was like. And this one in particular really stood out to me because remember what he had said about Ajax's body earlier, right? When my grandfather died, of course, Laertes, Odysseus' father, my father Odysseus blamed Nicanor, who was the father of one of the suitors, and the gods know why. He shot him with his great bow and threw the body on the beach for the birds to eat. The only thing he talked of by then was conspiracy, how the men of the island were gathering arms against him, how the servants were colluding in treacheries. At night he paced the hearth, and every word from his mouth was guards and spies, measures and countermeasures. And we even find out from Telemachus that Odysseus belittles his son by basically saying that younger men did greater things in Troy than Telemachus has ever done and will ever done, paraphrased. And so when Odysseus dies and his body is burned, Telemachus winds up telling Circe later, I didn't even shed a tear for him that he was gone. And if we could go to the next slide, Laura. Now we're going to hear from Penelope. And Penelope says, you know, I'm from Sparta originally, and I remember when folks would come back from the war and they would wind up being troubled and they would be restless and they would have unsteady hands. And then she says, my husband's hands were steady as a blacksmith's. And when the trumpet sounded, he was first to the harbor scanning the horizon. The war did not break him, it made him more himself. At Troy, he found at last a scope to equal his abilities. Always a new scheme, a new plot, a new disaster to avert. The war defined him. He could never separate himself from the war. Without it, he didn't know what to do, and he tried to find new disasters that wound up leading to, that needed to be averted. So when you think about sort of the descent of the character, you see the impact that the war had upon him. He gets that little thirst for blood, and all these problems that come up, the complex problems that come up, being a ordinary person again was not going to cut it for him. So that's this arc. And then I want to touch upon two other texts and then just sort of draw some conclusions that I have about the text altogether. So Laura, if we go to the next slide, please. The Inferno is its own little universe in some respects, because Dante does what Dante does best. He makes it up as he goes along. So in the Inferno, he appears in the 26th canto, which puts him fairly far down in hell. The way Dante arranges Inferno, just for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Inferno is a giant vortex that goes into the ground, and it's arranged according to failure of reason. So the less problems there are with reason are at the top of Inferno. The more irrational the sin, the further down it is. Odysseus is somewhere in the middle, and he's the evil counselor. And guess who he's bound up in all eternity with? Diomed, right? Why not? Right, one of his buddies from the Trojan War, and Dante has him encased in this forever tongue of fire. He and Diomed are in it together. And then he spins this entirely different narrative, right? That after he left Circe's island, he actually never went home. He wanted to continue to have adventures, and he manipulated his men into doing that. They forever keep wandering the seas, and they go to Spain and Morocco and the Isle of Sardes. None of that is in the Greek myth. I mean, Dante has no love for him because, of course, he's a nasty Greek who did all these horrible things to our ancestors. And then what winds up happening is that this whirlwind spins off of the coast and takes the ship and sinks it, so he never goes home. But the one metaphorical thing that's significant, I think, here is that he never went home after leaving Circe's island. Dante depicts that physically he never goes home, but the rest of the myth says mentally he never really comes home. So maybe Dante was actually onto something, even though he was just having a whole lot of fun at Ulysses' expense. All right, and the next slide, please, Laura. So as I mentioned, I didn't dig into piles and piles of literary criticism, but one book I started reading in regards to this is a book called Odysseus in America. And John Shaman, what he does with this particular text is he basically suggests that Odysseus's travels from Troy going back to Ithaca is actually a metaphor for Vietnam veterans coming back from the war and trying to reintegrate into civilian life. So I'm just going to touch upon this briefly. If you're interested in either the Vietnam War or Odysseus, I highly recommend this. This is a page-turning, insightful book. Just some examples of how he makes this connection. Stuck in combat mode, that's why they have the situation with the Sicones. Addiction to drugs, the Lotus Eaters, the need for adventure, why he stays in the Cyclops cave, losing opportunities that are given, the bag of wind that he gets from Aeolus, and on from there. danger from all sides. He reads the myth of Scylla and Charybdis as being a metaphor for that, as what Vietnam veterans experience when they're in the battlefield. Addiction to sex, high Circe and Calypso. So all of these different things that can perhaps suggest why Odysseus' story has some relevance in America. And I offer that as one interpretation of it for you folks. But that's not the only sort of conclusion I wanted to draw off of this. And if we could go to the next slide, Laura, just to kind of start wrapping up the presentation, what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about so the lessons or morals that I find are still relevant for readers today. First of all, what I think is pretty clear is that trauma is absolutely inescapable. We see that with Odysseus' story. And it's not just Odysseus who is experienced with that, it's various people around him. And of course, this is a war story, so it's the trauma from war and seeing one's friends die and all of that. I think that's true of any type of trauma. And I think that's why some people may be able to relate to some of the swings in Odysseus's mentality and such, and what he's going through and his emotions and all of that. Sins of the past will come back to haunt you. Well, my gosh, how true is that for each and every one of us? Look at how many times with Odysseus, something that he's done in the past, even if it's spoken the wrong thing at the wrong time, it comes back to haunt him later on. So certainly there's a lot of truth in that. Understanding one's family brings enlightenment. Family is huge throughout this mythology, right? Odysseus is the son of Laertes. Circe is the son of Sisyphus. It might make a difference, right? Telemachus wants to know who his father is because he doesn't know who he's supposed to emulate. Telegonus wants to know who his father is because he doesn't know who he's supposed to emulate. Polyphemus wants to know who his father is because his father's never shown up before. Is he a god or is he not? That's the rumor. So that helps you learn more about yourself, right? Even in Circe, that's an important piece. Who is Circe's father? And why does that matter? And why is that significant? So this mythology is rife with that. And a lot of folks now, we're involved with Ancestry.com. We like to kind of see who our families were so we can learn more about our past. Certainly that's important for today. The desire for home rules over everything. That's really, I think, one of the appeals of Odysseus' journey. He's trying to get home after a long struggle. And all of us in a microcosm can experience that if we're commuting home from work. Well, before COVID, we did that. I know mine was often an odyssey to come home. Would it be an hour? Would it be 2 hours? Depends. So certainly that desire to be home, your place, there's that sense of comfort that comes with that. Humility bears great fruits. When Odysseus is humble to the gods, things work out for him. When he winds up saying, I defy you gods, I'm going to do my own thing, bad thing happens. And we don't even need to kind of think of that in terms of like the spiritual cosmos. Just even humility, that someone who has a different opinion than you should probably listen to that. And there are numerous times when Odysseus doesn't even do that. Forget the gods. He doesn't even listen to his own men. Even good friends can become enemies, right? Maybe we've experienced that previously. Look, Odysseus and Ajax, and look what happens. But Odysseus tries to be a friend till the end, so in that respect, by providing honor for his burial. Lying provides short-term benefit, but not in the long term. I mean, look at the situation with Philoctetes, right? I mean, he's dumps him on the island and then winds up meeting him and then tries to lie, but it doesn't gain him anything. Only the truth actually liberates him. There's no salvation actually in lying. You can't control the actions of strong-minded people, no matter how hard you try. And Odysseus is one of those strong-minded people. He will do what he will do, but even his men are like that, right? And how many times have we been trying to convince people of something and we just simply can't? And I think the last bullet point, and Odysseus in America, I think brings this to the surface. War has always been psychologically devastating. It's not a new thing. I think it's a new thing that we're actually investigating that now. But there seems to be this larger truth throughout antiquity that wars change people. And that we should expect that someone who goes through long periods of suffering is going to be psychologically devastated. And if that's the case, how rich these particular texts are to help better understand the human condition. And so with that, if we could go to the next slide, Laura. This is my text that I use. and I wanted to open the floor for questions that you all might have.
If people can just type them in the chat, we can go through them if you have questions. Okay, so we have, Gretchen has a question.
Sure.
Hold on, Gretchen, I just have to unmute you. Oh, Gretchen, just unmute yourself and then you can speak.
My question was, what about Penelope?
What about her in particular? Do you have the question about?
What happens to her?
Okay, well, when we read the Circe novel, we know that she actually winds up going to the island with Circe, and she winds up sort of living out her existence there. She winds up sort of becoming the new Circe in some respects. As Madeline Miller kind of suggests to us, what winds up happening is that we realize that she actually is kind of a witch like Circe is, and that she actually has this ability to be able to manipulate certain things. It's why she was able to kind of keep the suitors at bay for some length of time. And then Circe actually winds up teaching her some of the fine things with witchcraft. To kind of complete the story, sorry, spoilers if you're going to go and read Circe after this, but I'll spoil away here. What happens is that Telegonus, Telemachus, and of course Penelope all wind up back on that island. Athena comes along and says, well, I want to take someone to go found this new civilization. And she winds up taking Telegonus with her to go and do that. And he becomes a significant figure in the civilization. Circe and Telemachus wind up becoming an item. And Circe winds up falling in love with him. And she winds up actually giving over her immortal powers so that she could sort of be with him and not have to worry about witnessing somebody else she cared about dying. And then Penelope is left behind on the island as sort of the new Circe. So that's sort of what winds up happening afterwards. Penelope seems a lot happier, though, when she's away from Odysseus, as Madeline Miller would tell the story.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There is a question in the chat. Did you see that, Mike?
I saw a question that come up about why are Odysseus' sons sort of named in a similar way, Telemachus, Telegonus. That's a good question, and I'm going to suspect it has something to do with the etymology of the name. I would need to actually look into that, that perhaps that somehow connects him to Odysseus. I think one thing that I didn't mention, doesn't answer the question, but I wanted to put it out there, is that Odysseus' name translates into victim of enmity, or it could also be from the root word in Greek meaning to hate. So that's sort of interesting in regard to that. If I was to kind of go with a hunch, Telemachus, Telegonus, it seems to me that that's sort of the tele part connects it to Odysseus in some way. But I think I would need to research sort of the etymology a little bit more in order to be able to answer that for you. Sorry.
Any other questions?
No, I see something up in the Q&A. It says
Yeah, that was the Penelope question.
Okay.
Oh, John Copeland has an answer. I mean, a question. Hold on, let me just let him speak. Okay, John, just unmute and you're all set.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep. Can hear you.
Fantastic, thank you. What a great talk. Thank you so much, and thank you, Attleboro Public Library, for doing this. This is fantastic. It's one of those books you hear about. I've not read it. It's one of the, or many, I've read The Inferno, but it's one of those books you read so much about, you hear so much about, and having not gotten to it, it's always been on the back burner to go, hey, what's this about? But it brings the question, as you showed a number of how this is still quite relevant today. But as an English professor, aren't there a lot of books that are equally relevant in covering, by now, thousands of years later, equally covering the same good points for reflection? And why would we choose the Odyssey over what those others are?
Right, that's a good question. One of the things that I find helpful for my students as well is to kind of give them a very broad perspective of literature. So yes, the literature from today, there's a lot of really great stuff that's been written, but there's also a lot of texts that have inspired that. So I think one of the things that's particularly important about a text like the Odyssey is the fact that it engages a lot of, first of all, I think it's an easier text to get into than the Iliad. But I feel like you have to have a certain mindset in order to be ready for the Iliad and the battles and the pages of battles that kind of go along with that. But the Odyssey itself, it tells an engaging narrative and it raises a lot of interesting questions. So if I'm going to sort of shape a course that's going to take into consideration literature from antiquity and literature from today, I'm going to kind of look at, well, where do some of these original questions start? And maybe I'll use some selections from the Odyssey to kind of introduce that. And then I probably would take and run that through the centuries, rather than just kind of jumping to today, just to show how this is a question that's been pondered and how some of these different texts actually go ahead and make an attempt to answer it, and what we can kind of learn about those answers from that time period to learn more about how we're evolving as a society. And I feel like, too, the thing about the Odyssey that has the appeal, excuse me, and honestly it's the big fantastic story. People like it. It's engaging. It's like, well, what happens next? Right? And I feel like that's sort of the important piece of it. And there have been different sort of interpretations of that, both in cinema and in theater. And it's just that piece of it has sort of probably inspired other stories. So even if you look at, some of the crazy battles that you would see with the fight between the suitors, you see modern fantasy. If you're doing a fantasy angle, you see a book like Lord of the Rings, where you have these epic battles as well that are of a caliber that you would see in something like Homer. So if there's a question of, where did these ideas originate and what inspired the authors of today, a lot of folks have read these texts. And it's important to make sure that students at least have that experience with it, or at least have a knowledge of it. It's one thing to kind of present them in a history class and say, oh, yes, here's the mythology, but it's another thing to actually experience it and wrestle with it. And different translations lead to different experiences. And I can tell you that, as you see, I didn't have a consistent translator for all of these, even though some of the same folks have translated the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, and they were actually three very different reading experiences. And I'm inclined to actually find a different translation so that I can actually get a different experience with it. And there too, what they do with language and the way that verse is done, there's a lot of things that we could probably say could kind of make a case for why to choose one of the older texts.
Thank you. I think that adds up pretty well. My sense of it is that it is a document that's foundational to a great deal of thought across our planet.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree with that, absolutely.
It really is a touchstone document. Thank you so much. I'll mute myself.
You're welcome.
There is another question. You touch the possibility that Odysseus is an unreliable narrator. Was this a novel literary device of the time, or can you think of earlier works that have unreliable narrators?
Oh man, I'm trying to think who the first unreliable narrator would probably be. The unreliable narrator piece is sort of it's a sort of a rhetorical question that I kind of pose to my own students, because of the fact he's depicted as being a liar, and then he tells you this fantastic story. He's like, believe me at face value. Why would you do that? So I feel like this is probably one of the earlier works where you could probably read that there's the unreliable narrative piece. I'm not 100% sure it's intentional, but then that also makes me wonder, and this is some questions that I have now about who Homer's audience is, it happens to be. And one thing that I was reading, it suggested that Homer's audience was probably two parts. It was probably a community kind of like the Phaeacians, who would be these rich folks who never saw a day in battle. And then there would be these other veterans who'd be kind of in the background, kind of listening. So on the one hand, you're kind of doing lip service to the rich folks, and then you're kind of winking and nodding towards the veterans who also might wind up being in the room. So, I feel like that's a sort of a tricky thing. I feel like the idea of using an intentional unreliable narrator is probably one of the more modern conventions. And by modern, I mean within the last several hundred years in terms of literature. When you get into sort of like the rise of the novel and such, I think that becomes a lot more intentional. But in terms of what I would think is being the first like definable unreliable narrator, I don't know. I don't think I have a very solid answer for that, but I have questions about Odysseus in that regard.
Thank you. Any other questions? We good?
Any other questions? Last call.
Last call. Thank you everyone for coming. I think, Mike, you did an awesome job. It was great.
Thank you. It looks like we, I think Gretchen, did you have another question?
No, that was her first question.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Mike.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun. Thank you again for everybody coming out tonight, and hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I hope you built your reading list. You may have noticed over my shoulder that there's the stack of books, right? So certainly, if one of these texts is one that you're not familiar with, I definitely encourage you to add it to your reading list. It's a great experience, really great experience.